We are starting today a little discussion of John Calvin. We've finished up Luther. You've taken a test on Luther. We're moving on to new things. So today I just want to give you a little bit of a bio connection with Calvin. As you know, do I have my... I don't think I do. All right, so this is just data. Just jot this down. Good stuff to know. Trivia. Church history, life of Calvin. He was born July 10, 1509. What year was Luther born? Anybody? Luther was born? Josiah? Correct. So, Calvin is a second generation. Luther is already a monk, by the time that Calvin is born. The Reformation hasn't happened yet, but certainly well on its way by 1509. He was born into a fairly wealthy professional family. It would be what was a growing middle class at that time. Not a peasant family, not a noble family, but kind of that growing professional class. His father was a lawyer, a devout Roman Catholic, as was his mother. His father also had some significant ecclesiastical responsibilities, so his dad was kind of a well-known guy. Calvin was quite distinguished as a child for his brilliance. Many times little children, right off the bat, you can tell that they're kind of smart, and so he got what was called a benefice to a cathedral, meaning it was like a little provision for gifted children, that kind of thing. Educated and so on. At age 14, in 1523, his father sent him to the University of Paris, and most of the rest of his education took place there. He studied philosophy, he studied Latin, he studied classics, he studied a lot of the stuff you've studied. The schools at that time, however, were somewhat more severe in their discipline. Some of you think we're awfully severe around here. But this was a live-in school, and floggings were quite common. If you failed to pass the test, it wasn't that you simply got a bad grade, it's that you got a whooping. And the food that they would eat sometimes had little vermin crawling in it, And so you'd have the rice in front of you, and then little lice in the rice, or little worms and things crawling around. And you didn't complain about it, because if you complained, then the beating you would get from the headmaster would be worse than simply, putting up with the stuff in your food. So anyway, it was kind of a rough time. But everybody was, that's just the way it was. If you're going to get an education, that's the way you did it. So that's what he had to deal with. At 1527, when he was 18 years old, he went to a school called Montehue, M-O-N-T-E-H-U-E, part of the University of Paris. He was a ferocious advocate of the Catholic Church and critic of the then appearing German Reformation. He hated Luther. He hated all things Reformation. He thought this was a horrible departure from the Orthodox faith, and he was vigorously opposed to it. This being about 1527. At this time, these people who were following Luther in France, which is where Calvin was, were called gospelers, or at least whatever the French equivalent is of that word, gospel. It was a derisive term. Gospelers, And he believed it was a flat act of treason against the Catholic faith, and he believed these people were heretics of the highest order. He was studying at the time for the priesthood, planning to be a priest, but his father had a falling out with the Catholic Church, Dad sends him an email and says, son, I want you to drop this priesthood business, and instead I want you to plan to become a lawyer like me. So Calvin, a kid who was always very obedient to his father, changed his academic career and began preparing, and indeed was trained as a lawyer, as Luther had been. So he went from Montague to a school called Orleans, which is also in Paris and part of the complex of the University of Paris. But that was the law school there, so he obtained his law degree. It was the most outstanding law school of the day. It'd be something like getting a law degree from Harvard or something like that. He was smart enough to be able to work in those circles. So he obtained his law degree in 1531. Then he stayed at the University of Paris to continue his studies in the humanities, especially Latin, Greek, other ancient languages, classical literature. And at 23 years old, he published, this would be in 1532, he published his first publication, his first writing. It was called De Clementia. De Clementia. Somewhat interesting. It was a commentary on Seneca's treatment of judicial clemency. First of all, who is Seneca? Matthew? Who is Seneca? S-E-N-E-C-A?
He's the... I remember the name.
Good. One of the most famous names in history. I'm glad you remember it. Anything about him? Spencer knows. I see a look of great wisdom on his face. Yeah.
He's a Roman politician.
Well, close. That's close. That's close enough. You get a cigar for that. Anybody can put a sharper point on that? Spencer, can you say anything more about Seneca than he was a Roman politician? Can you put him at a time in history, or what his general outlook would have been?
Well, I think I should leave other classmates to...
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
What a generous guy.
Yeah.
I tell you. Christian to the core. I'll tell you this. All right.
Yeah, you know.
All right, Kayla, you remember anything about Seneca? Megan? Oh, you guys. Jordan? Seneca. Who is it? Stephen? Come on.
Maybe.
All right. This is a little trivia. You should know it. These are just things that should be easily rolling around in your brains. Seneca is a Stoic philosopher, 1st century. He was one of the kind of advisors to Nero when Nero first took the throne. Much of what he writes sounds very Christian, though Seneca was not a Christian. Many people think maybe even the Apostle Paul had met Seneca, but because they are contemporaries. All right. So that's what you should need to know. That's what you should know about Seneca. Just trivia. Stoic, philosopher, politician, 1st century. Anyway, one of the things he wrote was a treatise on judicial clemency. What does the term judicial clemency mean?
I have no idea.
No idea. Good heavens. Ben, tell us. Help us out. Trevor? Judicial clemency. What is clemency? If you were in trouble, would you want clemency?
Yes.
Yes? Sydney, what is judicial clemency? No? What happened? Okay. Josiah? Go ahead. Josiah, let's hear it. Judicial clemency. Don't argue with him. He doesn't know. Not exactly. Not exactly. All right, judicial clemency. Note to self, a little more stuff here to put in the trivia banks. Clemency means mercy. Clemency means mercy. Judicial clemency, therefore, means obtaining mercy in court. Not getting the full punishment you deserve, but something less than that. Seneca wrote a treatise in which he argued that oftentimes judicial clemency is a more desirable action of the court than a harsh, brutal kind of, punishment. He was writing against the backdrop of things like crucifixions happening all the time and other brutal forms of punishment, and Seneca was arguing that, they should lighten up a little bit. It might actually be better. All right. Calvin wrote a commentary on Seneca's work called De Clementia, because Calvin himself, interestingly, was very interested in the whole idea of judicial mercy, which is somewhat surprising to people because he's usually regarded as this very harsh character. But all his life he had this interest in the notion of mercy, and especially judicial mercy in connection with understanding the nature of law. Well, anyway, he wrote that. That was in 1532. It was received very well. Calvin by this time was regarded as a man of letters. He was well educated and he was scholarly, and this work did get some traction. At the same time, he was very close friends with a cousin of his at the University of Paris whose name was Peter, or Pierre really, Robert. Looks like Peter Robert. Pierre Robert, who was himself a scholar in Hebrew. But Calvin became aware, gradually, painfully, over time, that Peter Robert was a gospeler. And that was shocking and horrifying to John Calvin, to suspect of this cousin of his that he very much respected, that he was on the dark side, And it put Calvin in a very touchy situation. Because Calvin, on the one hand, held as his highest value the obligation to obey authority. Obey the authority of the church in this case. And the authority of the church would say that if you thought somebody was a gospeler, you needed to turn them in, because it was illegal in France to adhere to the Reformation theology. This was an underground movement. And now Calvin becomes aware that his closely trusted cousin, very much respected cousin, is a gospeler. What to do? Should he turn him in and violate the friendship that he has with him? Or should he not turn him in and violate his sense of obedience? An ethical dilemma, and he was kind of twisting in that, conflict for some time. He had conversations with Peter Robert, and Peter Robert attempted to convince Calvin of the truth of the Reformation faith, and Calvin was unwilling to consider it. And he felt he was being put in this very impossible situation. And it was right in the middle of that conflict he was having that he's walking home one night. You know this story? You ever heard this? Calvin studies late at night, and he's heading home through kind of the dark streets of Paris. It's probably, 11 p.m., something like that, let's say. These dimly lit lights with street lamps, that kind of thing. And Calvin is kind of a very thin, sort of wiry guy. He's like 98 pounds dripping wet, that kind of thing. So he's walking along, and all of a sudden, out of an alley, this old man grabs him. Just reaches and grabs him, and kind of pulls him back like this, spins him around, puts his old face right up into Calvin's face and says, young man, have you heard of God's free gift? You know, and Calvin's terrified. You know what to make of this madman. And then immediately this old man starts preaching to him the Lutheran, Reformation gospel. You have faith in Christ and all of this. Calvin is just, he's trying to twist away from this guy. Get away from me. He doesn't want to get in trouble for even being involved in this conversation, because that's illegal. This old man is a whack job. He doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And so this whole thing really kind of traumatizes him. Finally, he's able to kind of squirm his way out from this guy's hold and runs down the street and escapes from this old man. But, excuse me, the conversation haunts him. And it sticks in his head. Young man, have you heard of God's free gift? And for the next several days, it was sort of hanging in his mind. Until about a week later, he's walking basically down the same street in the middle of the day. And as he's walking along, he glances down a street and sees a crowd gathering. And, you're kind of curious what's going on. And as he approaches, he realizes immediately what's about to happen. This is a fairly, I'll say it's not uncommon event of somebody is about to be executed, publicly burned at the stake for heresy. And the closer he gets, he realizes the guy who's about to be burned at the stake is none other than that old man who had grabbed him about a week earlier. And he's sort of transfixed by it, and he just kind of approaches. And this old man is standing there with a certain degree of grace and dignity, full self-possession and composure. And as they light the flame, he begins to sing. And he sings the recently penned hymn by Martin Luther, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And this old voice sings it out strong until finally his voice is extinguished by the flames. And Calvin is deeply affected by that whole experience. I don't know if you'd say that was the point where he was converted, because it's impossible to say. Calvin does not write a whole lot about his personal experience. This is one kind of rare story we have that he records later in one of his letters. But somewhere along the line in this time frame, 1532, 1533, we know that he was converted to the Protestant faith. We know that it took place by 1533 because in 1533 another friend of his, a guy by the name of Nicholas Cop, C-O-P, I suppose it would be pronounced Co, French, becomes the rector of the University of Paris, which would be comparable to being the president, And so Nicholas Cop has just obtained a very prestigious post as the head of the University of Paris, which itself was probably the most prestigious university of the day. So here is a man who has been able to achieve this incredible position. And it was expected when a person was installed as the rector of the university, of any university, that he would give a kind of academic speech. And so Nicholas Cop stands up at the inauguration to be rector of the University of Paris and begins to give a speech. And the faculty and everybody else assembled there become somewhat painfully aware that what Nicholas Cop is actually doing is giving a powerful defense of the Reformation theology of Martin Luther. And as he speaks, the longer he speaks, the more you can just feel the crowd becoming agitated and upset as they see this whole thing taking shape, until finally, by the end of the speech, Nicholas Cop literally has to run from the stage, fleeing it was kind of like Stephen speaking before the Sanhedrin, you know. They were out to get him. And so Nicholas Kopp escapes on horseback from being installed as the rector of the university. Well, it was also discovered at the same time that the guy that had written the speech that was being delivered by Nicholas Kopp was none other than our good friend John Calvin. So he was equally in trouble, and he also had to escape. And so in 1533, both Kopp and Calvin escape. Calvin dresses up as a peasant costume. He was, of course, a scholar, and is able to somehow shuffle through the metal detectors at the gates of Paris there, and makes it out away from Paris and to at least some degree of freedom. Well, from Paris he went to Basel in Switzerland. And while there, since he had nothing better to do, he mastered Hebrew. Guys like this make me mad, you know. I spent a whole summer, a few years back, I spent a whole summer determined to learn Hebrew in that summer. And I'm happy to report by the end of the summer, I could give you the alphabet, and I could sound out Hebrew words. That's it. Couldn't read them, couldn't tell you what they meant, but I could sound them out. I can't even do that anymore. But he spent about 6 months and actually mastered Hebrew, so... Anyway, while he was in Basel, he wrote some personal letters. Some of these are readily available, in which he lamented to his friend his great weakness that he felt he constantly battled, that he was so lazy. All I'm going to say to you is, if John Calvin was lazy, I'm dead. You know, that's the way that looks. But anyway, in 1534, he published his second work. It's a little book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. If you're familiar with the Institutes, you know that today, if you go by the Institutes, it's in 2 volumes. It's a pretty good sized piece of work. This is not the original version. He wrote it originally as a fairly short sort of apology on behalf of Reformation theology. It was dedicated to the King of France. His name was Francis. What else would he be named, you know? It was either that or Louis. It's going to be one or the other. In which he's attempting to get the King of France to back off this persecution of people associated with the Reformation. The book was an overnight sensation. It was kind of like the 95 Theses. It just spread. It was translated immediately into multiple languages, spread throughout Europe, especially countries touched by the Reformation, and it sparked, another kind of great renewal of interest in the Reformation. Calvin originally published it anonymously. He didn't want the public recognition, the public acclaim. But soon enough it was discovered who had written it, and so Calvin couldn't escape the limelight from that point on. Well, about a year later, 1535, he's heading back to France. Things have cooled off a little bit, and it's basically safe to go back to France. So he's on his way to France, but he stops in the little city of Geneva in Switzerland for the night, checks into a Motel 6. All he wants to do is get a good night's sleep, kind of bed and breakfast, be on his way the next morning. Turns in, it's about 11:30, 12 at night, and all of a sudden he hears this banging on the door. Calvin, what is this? Gets up, opens the door, and there's this huge guy standing there. A guy by the name of William Farrell, F-A-R-E-L. William Farrell. William Farrell is stands about 6'2". Calvin stands about 5'2", you know. Farrell has about 100 pounds on Calvin. He comes bursting into the room, and he just is so excited that the author of the Institutes of the Christian Religion is there in Geneva. And he thinks this is just incredible. He wants to, and he shakes his hand. You know how it is when some guy that weighs 300 pounds shakes your hand and you weigh about 100 pounds, and your whole body's going up and down in the air, you know what? Calvin's just kind of hanging on for dear life, and this guy slams him on the back, pats him on the back, you know, and nearly knocks the wind out of him. And, you know, so this kind of thing. It's this big old guy, just so excited. He tells Calvin he's got to stay in Geneva. You have to stay in Geneva. You cannot go back to Paris. Don't you know God has brought you here in His providence because this is the place you need to be. The people of Geneva need you, and I need you, and we need to get this Reformation here in Geneva off to a good start, and so you've got to stay here. Calvin said, no way, Jose. You know, not possible, impossible. You know, not going to happen. I've got to go back to Paris. I don't want to lead the Reformation. I'm not a political kind of guy. I'm not an upfront kind of guy. I just like my scholarly life, quiet, books, writing, people I don't like so much. You know, that's kind of Calvin's response. And Farrell just won't hear of it. And finally, Farrell gets pretty upset with Calvin. But Calvin is unmoved, and so it leads to what Calvin later called Farrell's dreadful imprecation, which I can give you verbatim. You don't need to write it down unless you want to, but here's what it says. This is what Farrell said to John Calvin at the end of this unsuccessful conversation. Quote, "You are simply following your own wishes, and I declare in the name of Almighty God, if you refuse to take part in the Lord's work in this church, God will curse the quiet life that you want for your own studies." And then Farrell turns on his heel, walks out, slams the door behind him, and leaves Calvin quaking like a leaf there, you know, in the midst of this firestorm that he's just encountered. Calvin later said, "I felt," this is a quote again, "I felt as if God from heaven had laid His mighty hand upon me to stop me in my course, and I was so stricken with terror that I did not continue with my journey." So Calvin stayed in town. You know, didn't like it, but there he was. One of the biographers of Calvin said, "It was obvious that Farrell and God wanted Calvin in Geneva. However, the Genevans did not." This was, and this is what you have to understand about Geneva. Geneva had become a kind of a refugee location for people fleeing from all parts of the world where Protestants were persecuted. So many from France and from elsewhere had shown up in Geneva. Many of these people had a very imbalanced understanding of what the Reformation was really all about. So anyway, the misguided understanding that was in many people's minds was that this notion of justification by faith alone, or justification apart from works, meant that works don't matter, and that there was this movement called the Libertines. The Libertines. Ever heard of this? Anybody know what a libertine is? Is that a term that's new to you? The Libertines. Josiah, go ahead.
Well, they're a group of people that believe that since they're saved, that they can live the lifestyle they want.
That's right.
They basically just believe in eternal security.
Okay, they believe in the most perverse
Yeah.
understanding of the term eternal security. I'm secure. I'm on my way to heaven. I got faith in Jesus. I don't need to worry. I can live any way I want. And so these are people who, in the name of justification by faith, engaged in the most outrageous forms of perverse, immoral, in many cases sexually immoral behavior. They had created in Geneva what was called by some people a sort of Reformation red light district. You all know what a red light district is, right? You know, old enough, I don't have to explain that. And so it was just awful. And so you'd have, just just ghastly, perverse expressions of what was, what made it so bad was it was all supposedly in the name of the Reformation. And Calvin himself, of course, was horrified by this, as I think any of you would have been as well. And so that was part of the reason Farrell wanted Calvin around, because he needed somebody to begin making the case in a fairly credible way that these two things are not compatible. To say you're justified by faith alone does not translate into this life of just reckless abandon from any moral restraint. It's not the same thing. And so these people retaliated not only against Farrell, but against Calvin. Calvin especially was the subject of their ire. And for some 2 years or so that Calvin was there in Geneva, he was treated to the most vitriolic abuses. People would name their dogs after him, He was hit more than once in the face by the contents of the chamber pot, if you get my drift. And otherwise, it was just kind of a really horrible time. He viewed that as a couple of years in hell. He hated Geneva. The one thing he wanted more than anything else was to get out of town. This was not where he wanted to hang out. It was as bad and worse as anything he could have imagined. And it was very much a happy day when he was actually driven out, along with Farrell, of Geneva. That was in 1538. So he's driven out of Geneva. And he said, "See ya." And from there he went to Strasbourg, Germany. All right, now Joseph has become elderly. And he wants to celebrate his old age, along with the rest of us, by distributing some little goodies, which I have given him permission to do. And so while he's doing so, you are going to keep paying attention to me and ignore that man behind the curtain there. And in about 5 minutes or so, we will, is that?
There's a lot of distractions.
I know. Thank you very much. All right, so Calvin is there. He is in Strasbourg. So he's in Strasbourg from 1538 to 1541. He basically takes a position there as a pastor of a French-speaking church populated by Huguenots. Who are Huguenots? Who are these people? The Huguenots, Megan?
They were the French Protestants.
That's right. French Protestants, they'd escaped, and they made it to Strasbourg. This is a German city, but of course it's a French refugee group there. So he's their pastor. He met two people while he was in Strasbourg that were to be very important in his life. One of them was a man by the name of Martin Bucer, B-U-C-E-R. Martin Bucer. You should hold this up so we can all see it. It says, "Happy Birthday, Joe." Lovely. We will sing to him in a moment. Martin Bucer was very helpful to Calvin in terms of developing some of his pastoral skills. I think it's safe to say that being a pastor wasn't Calvin's first love or first giftedness. He was more of a scholar, but nevertheless he developed skills under the help of Bucer. The other person that he met in Strasbourg who was to be important in his life was a woman by the name of Idolette de Bure. Idolette de Bure, D-E-B-U-R. Idolette de Bure was a widow. Her husband had been an Anabaptist who had, under Calvin's ministry, converted to the Reformation faith and then died in the plague. Idolette was left a widow, and eventually Idolette and John Calvin married. She was a quite interesting woman herself. there's a nice little biography of Idolette that you may come across sometime. If you're cruising through a used bookstore and you see this title, you should grab it. It'll probably cost about 59 cents, and it'll be worth, 100 times as much. But it's entitled Idolette. It's written by a woman whose name is Edna Gerstner, Gerstner. And it's the story of Idolette de Bure. Edna Gerstner's husband was a professor of church history at the seminary level for about 40 years, and he helped her in writing this book. She's a wonderful writer, but she got help from her husband. And so she does a dedication, and I think the dedication is worth the price of the book right here. I'm going to give it to you. So this is Edna Gerstner's dedication of her book to her husband, John Gerstner, and this is what it says, quote, "To John, my beloved husband, without whose help this book would have been far more interesting, but far less accurate." So there you are, Every time she wanted to embellish the story, every time she wanted to add a little juice in there, John Gerstner, nope, can't put that in there. So it's a very faithful recitation of the life, and it's still a very good book, even though she had to edit out some portions that John was not prepared to endorse. All right. In 1541, the leadership in Geneva had changed. They'd basically driven out the Libertines. The things had become so, horrible that they finally just made these people leave town or change their ways, one or the other. And then they emailed John and said, "Hey, please come back to Geneva." John said, "Forget it. You think I'm coming back to Geneva? There's more chance of that than that the Seahawks will win the Super Bowl." That's what Calvin said, quote directly. But in any event, Calvin was eventually persuaded to return to Geneva, and that was really the beginning then of his the most famous part of his career. He's there for about the next 20 years. So from 1541 until 1564. He's there in Geneva. Calvin is never a political official. He never has any political authority. Really, the only authority he ever has is moral authority, the authority of his counsel, the authority of his preaching and teaching, but nevertheless, Geneva reflects the contribution of Calvin both in its politics and in the life of its church. Calvin is a champion of what we call a Presbyterial style of governance, both politically and ecclesiastically, that is, representative government. He doesn't endorse the notion of monarchy or nobility. He really is the first guy to kind of advocate that all people are equal, finally. That's where Thomas Jefferson got that phrase, by the way, ultimately was from Calvin. All men are created equal because all men are equally corrupt. There's none of us that are inherently superior to any of the rest of us. So whether you're a king or a peasant, it doesn't matter. Before God, we're equal. And therefore it doesn't make sense to organize government based on assumptions of inequality, when in fact inequality is not the way things actually are. And that what we should do is vest authority in offices, not in people. And hence you have the notion of representative government, a Presbyterial form, and that became profoundly important in the Puritan tradition, which eventually was brought over to New England, and has caused some people to say that Calvin was the virtual inventor of America, which I think you can make that argument. Some of you may recall that Ethan last year did make that argument. In fact, that was his senior thesis. Calvin did a lot of work in terms of church government and so on. I'm not going to deal with all of that. It's interesting. All right. We will return to the thought of Calvin tomorrow. And in the meantime, happy birthday, Joseph, and you are dismissed.